Rain poured hard over Aroko village that night. The sky was dark and thunder rolled like angry drums. Little Nyasha, only 8 years old, sat outside her grandmother's hut, shivering in the cold. Inside, angry voices shouted her name. Her aunt's voice cut through the storm. She's cursed. Wherever she goes, death follows. The words stabbed through Nyasha's heart. Villagers gathered around with torches, their flames dancing in the rain. Their eyes were filled with fear and hate. Her mother tried to protect her, crying out, "Please, she's just a child." But no one listened. They dragged Nyasha through the mud, her tiny hands reaching for her mother, who fell to her knees, helpless and broken. As the rain washed over her face, she could hear the people laughing, calling her names. Witch child, evil girl. Their voices echoed in her ears as the flames of their torches faded behind her. She walked into the night, barefoot and soaked, her stomach twisting with fear. The wind howled around her like the voices of the village still chasing her. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. She wanted to cry, to scream, to ask why, but her voice was gone, lost to the storm. That night under the crying sky, Nyasha lost everything, her home, her family, and her name. From that moment, she was no longer the little girl from Aroko village. She was the witch child, wandering alone in a world that had turned its back on her. For many days, Nyasha walked with no direction, her bare feet cracked and bleeding from the sharp stones and hot dust. Her stomach ached with hunger, and her throat felt dry like sand. Each morning she woke up under trees or beside empty roads, her body weak but her heart still beating. She was only 8, but she had already seen more pain than most grown people. The villagers' voices still echoed in her head, "Witch child, evil girl," and every time she remembered, she pulled her knees close and cried quietly, afraid even of her own shadow. One hot afternoon, as she tried to walk, her legs gave up. She fell near the roadside, too tired to cry, too hungry to move. Her small body lay still on the ground, dust covering her face. From a distance, a woman who sold roasted maize noticed her. The woman had been calling out to travelers all morning, hoping someone would buy her food, but when she saw Nyasha lying there, her heart broke. She dropped her basket and ran to her. "Child, can you hear me?" she asked, shaking Nyasha gently. Nyasha's lips moved, but no sound came out. The woman reached into her small bag and pulled out her last piece of bread. "Here," she whispered softly, "eat, my child." Nyasha opened her eyes slowly, confused but drawn to the smell of food. Her fingers trembled as she took the bread. She chewed slowly, tears rolling down her cheeks. "They said I'm a witch," she murmured between sobs. The woman looked at her for a long time, her eyes filled with sadness. She brushed the dirt off Nyasha's face and said, "No, my girl, you are not a witch. People fear what they do not understand. You are just a child, and you are safe with me." Her voice was gentle but firm, like a mother's promise. That night, the woman took Nyasha to her small hut made of sticks and old sacks. The roof leaked and the floor was cold, but to Nyasha, it felt like a palace. The woman gave her some water to drink and wrapped her in an old blanket that smelled of smoke and maize. For the first time in days, Nyasha felt her body relax. She listened to the woman humming softly as she stirred the fire. The smell of roasted maize filled the room, and Nyasha's eyes grew heavy. As she lay on the mat, Nyasha looked at the flickering light from the fire and whispered, "Thank you." The woman smiled from across the room. "Sleep now, little one. The night is kinder than the world sometimes." Nyasha closed her eyes, and the sound of the rain outside mixed with the warmth in her chest. For the first time since she was called witch, she didn't dream of running or hiding. That night, under the woman's torn roof, Nyasha slept deeply, her hands curled under her chin like a child again. The fear that had lived in her heart began to fade, replaced by something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. She didn't know it yet, but this stranger's kindness would be the spark that changed the rest of her life. Years passed, and the little girl once called Witch grew into a quiet, strong young girl. Nyasha still lived with the maize seller, the kind woman who had found her by the roadside. Life was not easy. Every day Nyasha woke up before sunrise to fetch water, sweep the floor, wash clothes for neighbors, and help sell roasted maize in the market. Her hands were rough, her feet calloused, and her clothes torn, but her eyes never lost their spark. Deep inside, she carried a hunger greater than food, the hunger to learn. Whenever Nyasha saw children walking to school in their clean uniforms, her heart would beat faster. She would pause from washing clothes and watch them from afar, their laughter filling the air. She didn't feel jealous. Instead, she felt something like hope, as if their laughter was calling out to her, telling her she still had a chance. Sometimes she would follow them quietly until they disappeared down the road, then smile to herself and whisper, "One day." One afternoon, after a long day at the market, the maize seller noticed how Nyasha always stared at the old newspapers people left behind. She saw the way the girl traced her fingers over the letters, her lips moving as if trying to make sense of them. The woman smiled softly and reached into her small wooden box. She pulled out a crumpled, torn book, the cover faded, its pages yellow with age. She placed it gently in Nyasha's hands and said, "Learn, my girl, so they can never call you that again." Nyasha held the book as if it were gold. That night when everyone slept, she sat by the flickering light of an old lantern. She opened the first page and stared at the strange shapes and lines that formed the letters. Her lips moved slowly as she copied them in the dirt. A, B, C, her voice trembled, but her heart was steady. Night after night, she sat there, whispering words to herself, sometimes falling asleep with her head on the pages. The maze seller often woke to find the lantern still burning, the book resting beside the sleeping girl. She would smile and whisper a prayer for her. Nyasha refused to give up. Even when her eyes burned from the smoke or her hands ached from work, she kept reading. Every new word she learned felt like a small victory. Sometimes, when she got a word right, she would run outside and look up at the stars. "Do you hear me?" she'd whisper to the night sky. "I can read." She began to read anything she could find, newspapers, old signs, even torn wrappers from the market. Slowly, the world around her started to change. Words became her friends, her teachers, her freedom. Nyasha had nothing, not money, not fine clothes, not a school, but she had a mind that refused to break. And under that dim lantern light, she was no longer the witch child. She was a girl teaching herself to dream. By the time Nyasha turned 16, she had outgrown the little village where she once sold maize and washed clothes. The maize seller had grown old, and one morning she took Nyasha's hands and said, "My girl, the world is bigger than this place. Go and find your path." With a small bag of clothes, a piece of bread, and her precious old book, Nyasha began to walk toward the city. Her bare feet pressed into the hot dust, her heart full of fear and hope. She didn't know what waited for her, only that she couldn't stop now. The city was loud and full of people rushing in every direction. Cars honked, children laughed, and vendors shouted over each other. Nyasha had never seen such a place. But when she tried to ask for work, people looked at her ragged dress and turned away. "Go home, girl," one man said with pity. "We don't hire beggars," another snapped. Her stomach ached and her throat was dry, but she refused to give up. She knocked on door after door, sweeping compounds, cleaning dishes, anything that earned her a few coins to survive. But inside her heart, the same fire still burned, the dream of learning, of reading, of changing her story. One afternoon, Nyasha passed by a school gate. She stopped and watched the children run out, laughing and waving their notebooks in the air. Her chest tightened. For a long moment, she stood there, staring at the white walls and the sound of lessons echoing through open windows. Then she gathered her courage and walked to the gate. A teacher stood there, holding a bunch of keys. "Yes?" he asked, surprised by the sight of her dusty face and torn clothes. "Sir," Nyasha said softly, "I'm looking for work. I can clean, fetch water, anything you need." The man raised an eyebrow. You want to work here?" Nyasha nodded quickly, her eyes full of quiet strength. "Yes, sir. I'll clean the floors. Just please let me listen when the children learn." The teacher stared at her for a long time. She looked so small, yet her words were firm, steady, like she'd waited her whole life to say them. Finally, he sighed and said, "Fine, sweep," quietly. That evening, when everyone went home, Nyasha stayed behind. She cleaned every classroom until the floors shone, humming softly to herself. Then she stood in front of the big chalkboard, her heart beating fast. She picked up a small piece of chalk and, with trembling hands, began to trace letters she had once whispered under the stars. Nyasha, she smiled through her tears. For the first time, her name stood tall on a school wall. As she put down the chalk, she looked around the empty room. It smelled of dust and dreams. She pressed her hand to the board and whispered, "One day I'll stand here, not to clean, but to teach." And in that silent classroom, her words seemed to echo back, like the walls themselves believed her. The morning sun had barely risen when Nyasha swept the schoolyard, her broom stirring tiny clouds of dust. The children had not yet arrived, and the air was still. As she cleaned, she noticed a crumpled newspaper lying near the gate. She picked it up carefully, smoothing the torn pages. The words were faded, but to her they were treasure. She began to whisper them softly, her lips moving, her eyes full of light. She didn't understand every word, but she tried, sounding out the letters the way she had taught herself years before under a smoky lantern. A tall man stood nearby, watching her. He was a visiting missionary, an older man with kind eyes and clothes worn from travel. He had come to speak with the school's head teacher, but something about the young girl reading in the corner caught his attention. He walked closer, curious. "Who taught you to read?" he asked gently. Nyasha looked up, startled, clutching the paper like a secret. For a moment she hesitated, then smiled shyly. "The wind," she said softly, "and hunger." The man chuckled, not out of mockery, but with wonder. "The wind and hunger," he repeated. Nyasha nodded, eyes serious. "The wind brought the words. Hunger made me listen." The smile faded from his face as he looked at her barefoot, thin, wearing an oversized uniform someone must have given her. Hunger, he said slowly, deserves to eat. Come study with us. At first, Nyasha thought she had misheard him. Me study, she whispered, her eyes wide. The man nodded. Yes, you. I'll help you join the evening classes. That night, for the first time, Nyasha sat inside a classroom, not to sweep, but to learn. Her heart beat so fast she could barely hold the pencil. Around her sat children much younger than her, who giggled at her accent and whispered behind her back. Some even called her the old one or the cleaner girl, but she didn't care. She had waited too long for this chance. Every night after working all day, she came back tired but eager. Her hands still smelled of soap and chalk, her eyes heavy with sleep, yet she refused to miss a single lesson. The letters and numbers that once seemed like puzzles began to make sense. Her teachers noticed her determination. She studied under the moonlight, sometimes whispering her lessons to herself as she walked home through the dark streets. When exam day came, Nyasha sat at her desk with trembling hands. The other students laughed quietly, but when the results were posted, the laughter stopped. Her name was at the very top. She had stood first in the class. The same teacher who had doubted her the day she came to clean the floors wiped tears from his eyes and whispered, I was wrong about you. At her small graduation, Nyasha wore a borrowed dress and held her certificate tightly. The missionary stood beside her, smiling proudly. As the crowd clapped, she looked up to the sky and whispered, the wind and hunger did not fail me. The sun was high when a shiny car rolled slowly into Iroko village, the same place that had once thrown out a frightened little girl into the rain. The villagers paused in their work, shading their eyes as the car stopped near the old baobab tree. Children whispered, goats bleated, and the air grew still. When the car door opened, a woman stepped out, tall, calm, dressed in a neat cream suit that glowed against the red earth. Her hair was tied back, her eyes steady, but her heart pounded hard in her chest. It had been so many years, yet every corner of the village still carried her childhood shadows. Someone gasped softly. That's her, the cursed one, an old voice murmured. A few others stepped back, their eyes wide as if seeing a ghost. For a moment the old fear rippled through the crowd, but Nyasha stood still, her face soft, her eyes gentle. She looked around at the faces that had once screamed her name in hate and felt a strange calm rise inside her. She had dreamed of this moment, not for revenge, but for healing. She walked slowly to the center of the village, the sound of her heels crunching on the dusty ground. The villagers whispered louder now, some hiding their faces, others watching silently. Then she opened the car door again, and from it poured laughter, the bright, clear laughter of children. One by one, a group of little boys and girls stepped out, their uniforms clean, their smiles wide. They ran to her side, holding her hands, tugging at her sleeve. These are my students, Nyasha said, her voice calm but full of pride, and I came to build their school right here in Iroko village. The people stared, unsure of what to say. A few older women began to cry quietly. The same place that had once called her a witch was now hearing her speak with warmth and forgiveness. She walked past her grandmother's old hut, now cracked and covered in weeds, and placed her hand gently on its wall. This was once my home, she whispered. It will be a home again for learning, for laughter, for hope. One brave child stepped forward and asked shyly, Are you really a doctor? Nyasha knelt, smiling. Yes, little one. But not the kind who only heals the body. I want to heal hearts too. The child giggled and touched her hand, as if to check if she was real. Slowly, the villagers began to gather closer. The fear faded from their eyes, replaced by something new, respect. The old chief cleared his throat, his voice shaking. We drove you away, he said, but you came back with light. Nyasha nodded, tears glistening. Because darkness only wins if we let it, she said softly. As the children ran through the fields, their laughter echoing through the air, Nyasha looked up at the sky where the clouds drifted peacefully. She smiled to herself. The same sky that had once watched her cry now watched her return in victory, not to curse her past, but to rewrite it. The sun hung low in the sky, painting Iroko village in gold. The air was calm, filled with the sound of children's laughter, the same sound that had once been full of cruelty, but today it was different. The old huts glowed in the evening light, and people stood in small groups, still whispering in disbelief. The woman who had returned, the one they once called Witch Child, was now Dr. Nyasha Ndilavu, builder of schools, teacher of children, healer of hearts. As Nyasha walked through the village, her students followed her like a small parade, carrying their notebooks and giggling as they tried to keep up. She smiled softly, her heart warm. She had dreamed of this, not fame, not power, but peace. Every step she took felt like forgiveness being written in the dust beneath her feet. Then she saw her. Standing at the edge of the crowd, leaning on a stick, was her old aunt, the woman whose voice had once led the mob that drove her away. The years had aged her. Her hair was now white, her hands trembling. When their eyes met, the older woman froze, her lips quivering. Slowly, she began to walk forward, her limp heavy, her face wet with tears. The villagers watched in silence as she stopped in front of Nyasha. Nyasha, she whispered, her voice cracking. I was wrong. I was blinded by fear. I thought I was saving us, but I destroyed you. Nyasha stood still for a moment, her heart tight in her chest. She looked into her aunt's tear-filled eyes and saw not the woman who had cursed her, but an old soul carrying years of guilt. Slowly, she reached out and took her aunt's trembling hands into her own. Her voice was soft but strong. We all were wrong, Auntie, but the curse you spoke of, it didn't destroy me, it built me. The old woman began to cry harder, covering her face. Nyasha pulled her into an embrace, her arms firm, her smile gentle. Around them, people wiped their own tears, some out of shame, others out of awe. It was as if the whole village exhaled at once, the weight of the past finally lifted. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Aroko village came alive with joy. The new school stood proudly near the old baobab tree, its fresh paint shining in the fading light. Children ran through the fields with books clutched in their hands, shouting and laughing, chasing one another. Nyasha stood watching them, her students calling her name with pure affection. The woman once called Witch was now their hero, their teacher, their hope. The villagers who had once thrown stones now brought her baskets of food and warm smiles. The same people who had cursed her name now spoke it with pride. As the stars began to appear, Nyasha looked at her aunt sitting near the fire, smiling through her tears. The night that had once been filled with fear now glowed with laughter. And in that gentle light, forgiveness wore a smile. The morning of the school's opening was bright and calm. The whole village gathered under the big baobab tree, where colorful ribbons danced in the wind. Children sat in neat rows, their faces glowing with excitement. For the first time in Aroko village, laughter and pride filled the air instead of fear and gossip. At the front stood Nyasha, no longer the frightened child they once chased away, but Dr. Nyasha Ndilavu, dressed in a simple blue dress, her smile warm and full of peace. She looked at the new school behind her, freshly painted walls, shiny windows, a symbol of everything she had fought for. Taking a deep breath, she turned to the crowd. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of her journey. They once said I carried a curse, she began softly. The crowd grew still, every eye fixed on her. And they were right, she continued, her lips curving into a small smile. I carried the curse of dreaming too big in a world too small to hold me. For a moment, silence covered the crowd like a blanket. The only sound was the rustle of the wind and the quiet chirping of birds. Then one person began to clap. Slowly, another joined, then another, until the whole village roared with applause. Some clapped through tears, others shouted her name with pride. Nyasha's eyes glistened as she looked at the children waving their books in the air. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but her smile didn't fade. She whispered to herself, so softly only the wind could hear, the witch child built a kingdom of light. And in that moment, the curse that had haunted her became the fire that lit her world.